That's the one. So it has been a little while. Welcome back to learning some Zohar. Nice to have a few familiar faces returning. And pleased we got all the tech working. Um, as we've done before, trying to zoom in on a part of the Zohar that's relevant to our parasha this week, if only because it gives us somewhere to start, because the Zohar is so massive. So looking at something relative to the parasha tends to be a good way to at least center ourselves a little bit in the week. This week is Vayera, and the bit that I want to have a look at actually doesn't deal that much with the parasha itself, but it is in the context of the Zohar's commentary on the parasha, which, as often is the case, goes off on wild tangents. So I'm going to share my screen with us. Hopefully everyone can see that. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Whoop, that's too big. And we've got a passage here starting with Rabbi Abba, which is actually in the context of the parasha makes a certain kind of sense when we're looking at Abraham. We're looking at actually who is it that's eligible for divine favor? Why do the people who we start to meet in Genesis get chosen? What's so special about Abraham in particular, or about Moses, or about any of the others? And although it doesn't quite answer the question, the exploration becomes about how one structures their life and a little bit about, as a result, what happens in death. So this is actually a very famous passage in the Zohar, and the quotes that are here are very very commonly taken out and used elsewhere, particularly the idea that we're going to explore that whatever someone pulls themselves towards, that's what then follows them. But that you have a certain degree of control over what your spiritual life is like based on what you choose to pursue. So it's a suggestion that free will plays a huge role in one's life, and also a kind of sense of responsibility for one's own destiny, which actually is uncommon in a lot of mystical texts around the world. So it's quite an interesting theological moment as the Zohar is exploring this notion, which it, as we'll see, claims to originate with Abraham and the so-called children of the East, but actually is much more complex than that. So as we usually do, I think we will read and discuss and see if we can understand a little bit more about what Zohar is attempting to teach us. We're going to start with Rabbi Abba up here. And anyone fancy reading first for us?
Sure.
Oh, Jason, thank you.
Okay, shall I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Rabbi Abba opened, who may ascend the mountain of God? Who may stand in his holy place? Come and see. All those inhabitants of the world failed to see the foundation of their existence in the world. Days pass, ascending, standing in the presence of the Blessed Holy One. All those days lived by humans in this world, for they have all been created, and they all endure above. How do we know they have been created? Because it is written, days were formed. When days approach departing this world, they all draw near the supernal King, as is written, the days of David drew near to die. The days of Israel drew near to die.
Okay. So we have a general sentiment here, and then a particular reading of the text. As usual, the Zohar is hyper literal, and through that, trying to get this idea of days, every individual's days, having their own kind of persona. But before that, we have a question that's asked, right? The question is quoted from Psalms. Who is it that can ascend the mountain of God? Who can stand in God's holy place? Right? So this is the question that's informing this whole passage. Who is it that gets chosen to have a relationship with God? Why Abraham? Why Isaac? Why Jacob? Actually, as we're going on to read, none of them are particularly exceptional moral people. They're pretty average people. They make good choices and bad choices. There's nothing remarkable about them in any way, which is why it's such an interesting story. It's not answering the question yet. So we're going to take that question and put it to the side. Instead, it starts this teaching, which is always introduced with come and see. All the inhabitants of the world fail to see the foundation of their existence in the world. A certain degree of elitism. in which the Zohar, as often, looks at most people and say, most people have no idea what life is about. Most people have no idea what's going on around them. Most people are like automata, walking around, living their lives with no knowledge of what's really significant and really important, right? To them, to the average person, days pass ascending, standing before God each day as lived by people in the world, right? So literally, they're envisioning that each day of your life, as the day ends, it goes off to kind of report in to headquarters, and everything that happened during that day is then recorded as a result. So each day has its own kind of individual being, which is quite a weird idea. And the proof text for this, again, hyper literal, is reading the Torah where it says the days of David as he drew near to die. They literally mean the days of David, each of the days of his life, each went in and reported about what happened, as opposed to the normal reading of it as the days of his life, as we say idiomatically in English as well.
So just to clarify, are we talking about, does each day not only have a persona, but does each one belong to a particular person?
It seems like every person's experience of every day is itself a unique and distinct being.
It's individual. So my day isn't the same as your day.
Yeah, that's what it seems like, which is interesting, right? Because that's a lot of days. I mean, how many people are there, right? And every day, there's 8-9 billion copies of that day, each of which has its own individual lifespan and identity.
Which also, this is reminding me of one of the other sessions where we talked about how each pharaoh has each government has an angelic equivalent, and they also go and report. And also, isn't it said that like all of our actions create like good angels and bad angels that kind of, so this is instead of each individual action, it's like each day creates a thing. We personally create a thing.
Yeah, very similar concept, and also very, very deeply rooted in the Zohar, this idea that basically everything that happens is accounted for. Nothing is ignored. And what we choose to do during those days is both not incidental and also not forgotten. And this is the great secret, it would seem, that most people are ignorant of.
Presumably, this means, if you take it that way, that you shouldn't waste a single moment, and that you need to give every moment of every day meaning.
Yeah. I mean, look at this next line where they sum it up, right? Which we didn't read, but is the same sentiment. So while the person is in this world, he neither considers nor contemplates the foundation of his existence. Rather, he regards each and every day as if it passes into emptiness. Right? The mistake is to think that, oh, well, today is gone, tomorrow's another day. What's the difference? Every day is the same. Whereas the Zohar is doubling down on this very radical position of no, every single day has a identity and a significance and is recorded and reports to God. It's almost a little bit kind of intense, this idea that our days are reporting on us. But if it's a good day, that's probably not a bad thing. If it's a bad day, maybe we're less keen on it.
There's no turning it off and turning it on again for your days.
Yeah.
It's not actually said here, but I don't know why, but I'm reading this with a kind of vibe of days, the days pass ascending. Again, this isn't obviously isn't in the text, but there's this sense to me of perhaps individual days ascending by varying degrees, so that like some days ascend further than others depending on their content, their quality.
Interesting.
I'm not sure why I'm reading that from it. I just kind of got that feeling from it.
I don't think it's necessarily wrong, actually. Like you said, it doesn't say exactly, it doesn't spell out the procedure of this whole thing, which itself could be debated. But we are going to get onto a sense that the implications of our actions have various paths they can take, some of which are better than others, and all of which have a rebound on us. So it's not perhaps too out of the theme in which it's exploring to say that actually they're not all just going to the same place. There's a cause and effect to everything that happens, and it, something we see throughout the Zohar is this idea of the universe as being quite mechanistic, every action has a reaction and it impacts on something and it results in certain other things changing, none of which is often very transparent to us. And we think, oh, well, another day gone, but actually something else is happening, which most people, it would seem, fail to appreciate. Again, remember, we're trying to answer the question of what makes for some people able to be in touch with God, be able to ascend the mountain of God. Maybe part of it is the cognizance, the consciousness of actually every moment, every action, every day being significant and meaningful, which is very hard to sustain. Everybody deserves a day off once in a while.
In Kohelet, I'm thinking, how does it go there about each day comes, each day goes? What's this say?
Yeah, the sun rises and the sun also sets, then the sun returns once again to its place. A generation goes and a generation comes. And similar language, but often understood in the opposite sense, right? That actually Kohelet is talking about the never-ending routine of nature. It just goes over and over and over and over again. Whereas the Zohar is saying, yes, it happens over and over and over again, but each time is significant. Each time is meaningful. So I don't know if it's contradictory or complementary, but definitely feels like that same kind of language, right? And both of them are trying to get us to value our time and to do the most we can with our time. Because obviously the time is limited. At some point, the soul is going to depart the world. And let's see, as a result, what happens. Jason, do you want to read on a bit more?
From when? Okay. When a soul departs this world, which way she will be wafted is unknown, because the way ascending to the realm of radiance, where supernal souls shine, is not extended to every soul. For as one draws down upon himself in this world, so is he drawn up, so is he drawn upon departing. Okay, yeah?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Yeah. Come and see. If a person is drawn toward the Blessed Holy One, his desire pursuing him in this world, then afterward, when he departs, he is drawn toward him and extended away to ascend, following the attraction drawn daily, aspiringly in this world.
Okay, so how do we apply this idea now to the afterlife, or the question of what happens in the afterlife?
You have to set yourself up with good habits. Like now, it's kind of like you have to get a involuntary muscle response in your soul. You have to do something so much that it becomes automatic, so that when you lose control of yourself, which happens after death, you no longer can control a form that contains you. The soul continues to behave as you did, if you want to be drawn close to the Holy One, which is presumably an ideal form of afterlife.
Yeah, I think we can assume that's the case, that that's the goal. I think you're right that it's there's a sense of danger, right? That actually the soul is not able to determine its fate on its own. But if you condition yourself while it's in your body to develop a sort of resonance with the good stuff, then it'll naturally gravitate that way after death. It's almost like, I like your idea of it's kind of like working out a muscle that, you know, it gets stronger and stronger and then it's there and it's able to be used. Also seems to me a bit like a kind of charging a magnetic or electric force in something, right? You're kind of like adding a charge to it. And so it's very, very heavily charged at the time of its the death of the body. And as a result, it naturally goes that direction.
I kind of
Feels a bit fragile. Sorry, Lee.
Sorry, no, I interrupted you. I didn't mean to.
No.
That, to me, there's a strong sense of like being pointed in a direction. And the imagery that comes to mind is like a mirror. Like if you point a mirror at a source of light, if you point it directly back at the source of light, the light will bounce back towards its source. If you angle it away from the light will refract off in another direction. And I kind of feel it's like that. If this mirror is pointed directly towards God, then the light eventually points directly back at God. Whereas if it's angled slightly off or facing far away, the direction becomes less direct.
It's really interesting. So rather than charging something or working a muscle, you're kind of finding the right angle to orient yourself as a mirror,
Yeah, because
waiting for that
whatever
moment.
you're
Then you're
pointing
set
at,
up.
yeah, whatever you point yourself at, that's the direction you're going in.
I like that. Kind of calibrate, find the right bearing so that it's naturally in the right spot.
It also reminds me of my favorite, I think it's a Hasidic story, so I'm sorry, Rabbi Adam, but it's a story about the afterlife and how after you die, you are going to be shown someone's life, and you have to judge whether they've lived a good life or a bad life. And what you don't know is that they've wiped your memories and you're actually judging your own life. And so you should get in the habit while you're alive of always judging people favorably, so that when the time comes and you're judging your own life, your instinct will always be to judge favorably. And this gives me that same.
It's really interesting. We'll forgive its Hasidic origin because actually I think there's a nice sentiment there about conditioning oneself to be well prepared for the challenges, the trials of death. Right. This is almost mythological in the sense of, you can think of Hades and Styx and the journey the soul has to take, and there's something kind of frightening and uncertain about death here, which you can do stuff to prepare for. Not in the Christian sense of you can set up your salvation so you can have a promised everlasting life, but in a sense of kind of calibrating, orientating, designing your soul to be ideally positioned.
It's that sentence, for as one draws down upon himself in this world, so is he drawn upon departing. It seems that what you're doing, that it's the first part when you're alive is active, and then it's passive, but the passive is informed by your actions.
Yeah, you develop a pattern. You know what it makes me think of, what you just said, Robin, is the famous challenge of Pharaoh in the Exodus story, who hardened his own heart for the first 5 or 6 plagues. And then after that, God describes God as hardening his heart. And one of the common explanations is that it's once you've done something over and over again, you eventually just kind of condition yourself, you pattern yourself into this, and you can't escape from it. It becomes automatic. And here it's a positive, right? That if you condition yourself to value every day, to do good things every day, to constantly orient towards God, then you're naturally going to be able to go and ascend as it describes after death.
Now I'm thinking of like
negative.
Now I'm thinking of like a rocket in space. Hear me out on this. A rocket in space, but like if you if death is represented by the rocket running out of fuel, the rocket will continue with the same momentum in the same direction it was going. And it will have no control over that after that point. That's its final trajectory.
It's a very sci-fi version, but it works. Yeah. It's just drifting, right? It'll just be carried in the vacuum in that direction. So you want to make sure it's pointing the right way when it runs out of fuel.
Yeah.
I bet Rabbi Abba would have loved that, by the way, if he knew what a rocket was. Okay. He has some more on this, Rabbi Abba. He's unusually verbose, and he shares a little story about how he came to this teaching. Someone else want to read for us from here?
I'll do it.
Yeah, thank you, Robin.
From the top.
Yeah.
Rabbi Abba said, "One day I happened upon a certain town formerly inhabited by children of the East, and they told me some of the wisdom they knew from ancient days. They had found their books of wisdom, and they brought me one, in which was written, 'As one's aspiration is directed in this world, so he draws upon himself a spirit from above, corresponding to the aspiration to which he cleaves. If his aspiration focuses on a supernal entity, he draws that entity from above to himself below. If he aspires to cleave to the other side, focusing there, then he draws that from above to himself below. They said the essence of the matter depends on words, action, and the aspiration to cleave, whereby the side to which one cleaves is drawn from above to below. I found in it all the ritual acts of star worship, requisites, and how to focus the will upon them, drawing them down.
Okay, so let's digest the first part of the story before we look at the second half. So what is Rabbi Abba telling us about? What did he find? What did he learn? How did this inform his own philosophy?
Sounds like he spoke to some maybe Vedic traditions, like Hindus, for example, especially with the what you call star worship. There's a heavy emphasis on astrology in Hinduism.
Yeah, very good. You typically, children of the East is a reference to Vedic communities. They're not usually too specific. We don't know exactly what kind. Also, sometimes they seem to blend Zoroastrian experiences with Vedic ones, and also sometimes others that they've encountered or they think exist. Not sure how real these examples are. Many times Zohar talks about children of the East, or how much this is just their fantasy about, some kind of early.
It ties pretty well with Hinduism though, because like in Hinduism, obviously the different deities that Hindus can worship represent different attributes, maybe different facets, different aspirations. I think it ties quite well there.
I think you're right. So he tells us. Sorry, Zachary.
No, just it's like, for me, it's really remarkable. We have a rabbi bringing like almost a source from another religion and saying, see, like this is like just a fundamental fact of the universe that people are aware of, even people of different faiths. Like, and that's awesome.
Yeah, the quote he seems to have from the book that the children of the East discover is more or less exactly what he taught on the previous page, right? I mean, almost word for word. And it's the same idea, right? That actually, whatever you aspire to, whatever you put your focus on in this world, that kind of attaches a matching spirit to you. So if you focus on good stuff, then you kind of have a good spirit that attaches to you. You have a good orientation, a good focus, a good projection, whatever it might be. And the other side, dun dun dun, is always key for bad stuff. Literally, the sitra achara, the other side. If you focus on that, then you're going to get bad stuff come your way. So you're going to end up kind of choosing in some way what your pattern of life looks like based on what you choose to put your attention on. Now, the children of the East, they said that the essence depends on words, action, and the aspiration to cleave, which actually I think we can get behind, right? And Rabbi Abba can get behind. It depends on kind of what you say, what you do, and also what you want, right? If you really desire, if you aspire to be on this side, then that matters. That's what actually has an effect. But the side to which one cleaves is drawn from above to below. So there's this idea that's often expressed in Hasidic and later Kabbalistic sources of kind of the desire comes from below. And that's what you see here, right? Is actually the spiritual realm is something which we can tap into and utilize and access, but it starts from us. It doesn't just kind of fall on us. There's no election as there is in many Christian texts, and there's no kind of sense of the prophecy being something where God just chooses someone and goes, you're a prophet now, like in modern TV shows. Even prophecy is something which is drawn down from above to below, but it starts with the drawing down below. So the prophets trained, they went to school, they practiced, they conditioned themselves, they meditated, and through that they drew down the spirit of prophecy into themselves. And that's exactly what you see here as well, is that our moral behavior draws down a certain characteristic, which then gets attached to us. And it's about what we think, or rather what we say, our words, what we do, our actions, and also what we want, or where our desires actually lie, which, people can lie to themselves about, but ultimately is something that often is not transparent to others.
What about this use of the word cleave in particular? It's an interesting. It's making me think of, like, I know I'm using a lot of metaphors here, but it's making me think of like cutting through bushes, or maybe like mining with a pickaxe, like the direction, again, a direction centric thing. I don't know if that's how that should be read, but
it's weird. I mean, he uses this word. So the word in Hebrew is devek or devekut, which is used in Deuteronomy and used very frequently elsewhere. And cleave actually is a strange word in English. And Denny Matt comments on this in one place in his footnotes, that cleave can mean both joining two things together and also simultaneously splitting two things apart. So something which is cloven is something split apart, like cloven hooves. But also to say that you cleave to something is that you cling to it. So the word has dual and completely contradictory meanings, which I think is purposefully chosen as a result here. That it's more. I would say, if we had to say, it's much more about what you choose to attach yourself to. It's about attachment, right? When we get up to read the Torah, we all say the line from Deuteronomy, "Atem hadvekim b'Adonai Elohechem hayom," right? You are cleaving to your God today, meaning you're attaching yourselves to God. You're drawing that influence and that connection to you. So it's really more about attachment than it is about separation here. Okay, let's carry on. Robin, do you want to read a bit more? You do great.
Similarly, with one seeking to cleave above to Holy Spirit, for the matter depends on action, words, and aspiration of the heart, focusing on that entity, drawing it toward him from above to below, cleaving to it.
This is, again, this is the prophecy, right? Just sorry to interrupt you, Rob, but this is Holy Spirit here, Ruach HaKodesh. This is prophecy, right? The prophets actually start by conditioning themselves, by affecting their behavior, by learning in how to be the sort of people that can draw down the Holy Spirit. They're not, this isn't the movie version where they're walking down the street and they hear, "This is the voice of God" one day, right? It's completely the opposite, which is that they are actively trying to tune themselves. I often think about this like a radio. They're trying to find the right band on their own tuning in order to then pick up a signal. But it starts with them, which is, I think, really important to say, because it means that a lot more people can be prophets than would happen otherwise. Prophecy is much more accessible.
Shall I carry on?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. They said, as a person is drawn in this world, so is he drawn when departing this world. Whatever he cleaves to and is drawn to in this world, so too in that world. If holiness, holiness. If defilement, defilement. If holiness, he is drawn toward that side, cleaves to it above, and is transformed into an ordained attendant, ministering before the Blessed Holy One among the other angels. So he cleaves above, standing among those holy beings, as is written, "I will give you free access among these standing here," Zechariah. So too, correspondingly, if defilement, he is drawn toward that side, made like one of them, clinging to them. They are called wounds wreaked upon humans, and when he leaves this world, they take him and drag him into hell, to that region where brood of defilement are punished, those who have defiled themselves and their spirits. Afterward, he clings to them, becoming a wounder, like one of those universal wounders.
Okay, we've got some intense theological speculation here, and we've got some strange language. So the principle, right? Again, we're quoting still from the Children of the East from Rabbi Abba, right? Is what we expect. As a person is drawn this world, so are they drawn when departing the world. Whatever you do in life is what you're going to end up doing in death. What you cleave to and what you draw down, that which you tap into and draw onto yourself, that is what will then come to draw you out when you die. If it's holiness, then you get holiness. And if it's defilement, then it's defilement. Obviously, there's other options, hopefully, but they're using the extreme. It's a little bit black and white. There's only holiness or defilement, it would seem. So what happens if you condition yourself to be oriented towards holiness? What happens to you after you die?
You become an angel.
Yeah. Right. You become an angel. You're now one of those ordained attendants, ministering before the Blessed Holy One. And this promise of Zohar will give you free access among those standing here, meaning you're going to get to hang out with the angels, whether you're an angel, whether you're kind of like I don't know, someone who's like lurking in the background, doesn't really matter. You're kind of up with the cool people, right? You're where you're supposed to be. We don't want to too much get drawn into this idea of heaven and hell in Christian communities, because this isn't quite the same thing. It's more about kind of your afterlife being designed and based on your life. Whereas, I think heaven and hell are often unfairly distributed in many Christian theologies, with a lot of people going to hell, for instance, for seemingly arbitrary reasons. Whereas here, if during your life you draw yourself towards defilement, if you're always drawing yourself towards defilement, you cling to defilement, you cling to all that, what happens to you?
You go to hell.
Yeah, you go to hell, which again he translates as hell, but it's not really that hell. You go to the bad place, let's call it, and you get turned into a wounder, which is a lovely English translation of the common word for demons in this literature, which is mazik or mazikim, right? Which are the ones who hurt, the ones who wound, right? And there's a mythology that many of the injuries that occur to humans are a result of these kind of evil spirits. It's somewhere between what we usually mean when we say evil spirit and between what we usually mean when we say demon. But the result is it's a self-inflicting punishment.
And it's interesting, it's sort of more, it's not like, well, so it's that you go there, you get punished, and then you become someone who carries out the punishment.
You get recruited.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like how do I put it? There's a sense of like the human entity being this kind of neutral form between good and evil, and the course of your life determines which of these two factions you're actually choosing to be a part of beyond life.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to take that exactly. I'm not sure what to think from that.
Yeah, it does feel overly simplistic, right? That like, okay, do you want to be on team good or team bad? It also doesn't recognize the fact that most people's lives are a combination of good choices and bad choices. And, how do you assess whether on balance someone has drawn themselves more towards holiness or more towards defilement? Is it you have to be 51%? Is it a referendum? You just have to be a little bit better than worse? Or is there a threshold? Is it a 2/3 majority? It doesn't explore that for us. And it doesn't explore what the middle might look like. What if you're actually someone who is equally good and bad? Are you split in half? Do you just end up in, Christian version of limbo? It feels very much, we're getting into kind of Catholic territory here with
Yeah, it really
it's
does feel quite Christian. Yeah.
it's a little bit too prescriptive about what might happen to you after you die.
And also, like the thing I was saying about choosing factions, it makes me think of Christian eschatology with like a war between heaven and hell kind of thing. Like you're choosing a side to be in that. I'm not sure. I don't think I like it very much.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
actually,
Sorry.
No, just I feel like later Kabbalah comes in and kind of like fills in the middle ground here because we have the whole concept of the Beinoni, someone who is in between a tzaddik and a rasha, a perfectly saintly person and like a completely wicked person. And I've always had it explained to me that like you create angels with your actions, and they're like good angels or bad angels, maybe demons here, and like it's your actions that create the things that you greet on the other side. Once your soul leaves the physical world, you are greeted by the consequences of your own actions, and actually like the punishment you get is like you created it. It's like a weirdly karma system. This feels less that. It feels like there is an external evil that comes for you if you are drawn to it rather than creating it.
So it does feel different, but it's actually the same thing, right? This is the basis of that whole idea. And the version in particular that you're describing is the one that at least I've read in, say, Rav Steinsaltz's 13 Petaled Rose, which is where he's taking Tanya and trying to make it into a kind of contemporary psychological statement of theology, where, yes, it's not demons, it's your own bad actions, which sounds a little bit more palatable to modern ears, I think. And I don't think necessarily Rabbi Abba would disagree with that. If pressed, he might say the same thing, but he doesn't talk about it in psychological terms. He talks about it in very, very material terms. That there's like these bad things that are going to come get you, which I think we all find upsetting. I also could stomach it a bit better if we talked about it as our actions become beings that then, we have to confront, because that feels totally fair, right? Like the afterlife is completely self-regulated. You get what you deserve by definition. Although maybe it's not so simple there either. But Rabbi Abba also isn't 100% satisfied with this philosophy that he's sharing with us from the children of the East. So let's say what his critique is. Thank you, Robin, for reading for. Someone else want to read from here? I said to them.
I'll go.
Yay.
I said to them, my children, this is close to words of Torah, but you should shun these books so that your hearts will not stray after these rites toward all those sides mentioned here, lest, heaven forbid, you stray from the right of the Blessed Holy One. For all these books deceive human beings, since the children of the East were wise, having inherited a legacy of wisdom from Abraham, who bestowed it upon the sons of the concubines, as is written, to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts while he was still alive, and he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the East. Afterwards they were drawn by that wisdom in various directions.
Okay, so what's his criticism of this philosophy that he's quoting from the children of the East?
That it's idolatrous.
Yeah, he doesn't quite trust it. He'd rather people just focus on the right of the Blessed Holy One, aka right, kind of Jewish practice. And it's worried that this is opening up too many paths for people to stray down. He doesn't really like the idea that there should be an option between holiness and defilement. He just wants you to be on holiness, right? And kind of don't think about defilement. That's not an option, it would seem. Whereas the texts he's quoting seem much more neutral and saying, well, there's this, there's that. It's up to you which you choose. He seems a little bit anxious about that.
But why is he encouraging presumably non-Jewish people to become Jews? Like, what? That's not part of the thing, is it?
Well,
like that.
there's clearly a connection, right? This is his whole thing that they were so wise because they got it all from Abraham, right? Abraham gave gifts, it says in the Torah, to the sons of his concubines, and they all went eastward. And the gifts are the sources, the wisdom, these traditions. Whenever the Kabbalists encountered things in the Eastern traditions, the Vedic traditions predominantly, that they liked, they went, this is the gift Abraham gave to his concubine sons, right? They have yoga, we have yoga. They're doing the same thing. They got that from Abraham, right? It's like, it's a convenient explanation.
It kind of feels like it's slightly critical of Abraham's wisdom as well. Like it's suggesting that taking this wisdom and going elsewhere with it ends up leaving you directionless. Because if you're, if a group of people are all directionless, they may all go in different directions. Hence the final sentence there.
Yes, right. They started out with the wisdom of Abraham, but after that, they kind of, other things got included mistakenly, it would seem. So he does seem a little bit suspicious of how reliable this tradition is, despite himself having taught it only a few moments ago, and then quoting this tradition in which he found it in a book in a town which used to be inhabited by these Eastern children.
It's like he's explicitly. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. It seems he's explicitly saying that they were drawn by that wisdom in various directions. So he's saying that it's literally, but from Abraham's wisdom that they were drawn into these various directions that can't be trusted. This is critical of Abraham's wisdom.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's, if you consider the trajectory of the Torah, you don't want to stop with Abraham, right? You don't want to say, okay, Abraham had a relationship with God. He understood monotheism. So he tried to kill his kids. So he wasn't very nice to his other kids. So he had a conflict in his home. So, so all these other things. But you don't really want to stop there. From the point of view of the rabbinic tradition, you want to get to Moses, who is much better. And there's actually a whole passage of the Zohar slightly after this that explores what's the difference between Abraham and Moses, and why is Moses better, and all these kind of elements of personalities, which is all coming back to our starting question: who is it that gets to be on the mountain of God? So they're going to try and come back to this question a little bit. And we're gonna try and get to the end of it. There's only a few more paragraphs here. and see if it gives us any answers. Although in typical Zohar fashion, leaves us more questions than answers, I think. Zachary, do you want to continue? Were you reading? No, who was reading?
I was
Lee, you were
reading.
reading.
Yeah, I'll carry on.
No, Lee, you take it.
You go next, if you want. Not so with the seed of Isaac and the share of Jacob, for it is written, Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Holy heritage of faith to which Abraham cleaved. From that share, from that side issued Jacob. What is written? Behold, Adonai was standing over him. And similarly, you, Jacob, my servant. So a person should be drawn to the Blessed Holy One, cleaving to him.
Okay, so what's different between us and the children of the East? We both have Abraham as our patriarch, and we both got wisdom from him.
Yeah, it ties back to the previous paragraph because it says that they went away from Isaac, so they sort of moved away from the traditions of Abraham's line. And also this line, Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, which implies the gifts he gave were only partial, they were incomplete, whereas Isaac got everything.
Very good. Yeah.
The holy heritage of faith.
Holy heritage of faith. Yeah. I mean, what Abraham mostly gave to Isaac was trauma, to some extent. But in addition to that, the holy heritage of faith, right? From our point of view, we can. It's interesting as an interfaith moment because we can look at these other traditions and go, yes, actually, they too have some kernels of wisdom. They've got stuff from Abraham. They start in the right place, but they kind of diverge or they add these other things, and it's not complete. They don't have the whole picture. But Isaac, right? Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. He gave gifts to the others, but he gave everything he had to Isaac, which is actually quite a clever way to root this whole discussion in text. Right, to show that actually you can find wisdom in other traditions, but it's always going to be slightly incomplete, and you want to corroborate it with our tradition, which of course has the true, authentic lineage. As flawed as that might be from a modern point of view, it does make a certain kind of sense here in the Zohar. Okay, now they're going to try and answer the question again a little bit. They don't succeed, but let's see what they say. Zachary, why don't we switch to you now because you're going to enjoy this. It's got some body trauma.
Amazing. My favorite. Come and see, who may ascend the mountain of God? Scripture responds explicitly. One who has clean hands, whose hands have not fashioned a figure, nor grasped what they should not. One who has not been defiled by them, nor defiled the body with them, like those who defile themselves by hand defyingly. This is one who has clean hands.
Okay, so we're going back to the context of this original quote from Psalms, right? Which, if you knew the verse, you knew where it goes, right? It says, "Who is the one who can ascend the mountain of God? One who has clean hands." That's the next line. And what do they mean by that here? There's a whole list of things.
I think someone who hasn't done forbidden things with those hands. I know the Zohar is especially concerned about the spilling of seed. And I think that there's a reference here because the quote that they bring to talk about that is like, your hands are full of blood, and they also use that kind of analogy, which is, so for me, that's kind of mirroring this here.
Yep, you're not wrong. We have the usual anti-masturbation rhetoric, which has its own interesting, complicated history in the Zohar for a variety of reasons. It's not just that. Right, although that is definitely there. We also have, the idea that your hands are what you would use in order to create idolatrous images, and also behavioral, ethical, right? The hands grasping what they should not. It's about stealing, right? About kind of taking things that aren't yours, right? That also happens to your hands. So it's about religious crimes of idolatry and interpersonal crimes, ethical crimes of stealing, and also very much sexual crimes, which in this case understood as masturbation. This is how you define someone who is legitimate and eligible for being seen as ascendable on the mountain of God. Someone who is moral, ethical, spiritual, sexually, and business-wise, in every other regard, ethically orienting themselves, which is a big ask in some way, but it's not the only ask. There's more to the verse. What does it go on to say?
And a pure heart, similarly. One who is not drawn upon his will or heart to the other side, drawing himself away from the worship of the Blessed Holy One.
So as usual, heart here, lev, is not actually it is heart literally, but they mean mind, right? Your intelligence, your brain, your intention. So in addition to having clean hands, your behavior, you also have to have a good intention, right? You can't draw your will towards the other side. This is, again, a way of reframing the whole teaching about if holiness, holiness, if defilement, defilement, but rather than in the Children of the East language, it's in our language, it's in the language of Psalms. And the last
Disagreeing
bit?
with the sermon on Yom Kippur. Thoughts do
Uh,
matter.
maybe, I mean, I'm not. It's an interesting question about whether what it means to draw one's mind, draw one's will to the other side, and notably it focuses on action, drawing himself away from the worship of the Blessed Holy One. Is that about your thoughts? Is it about what you do? It seems a little bit fuzzy, but interesting conversation.
Carry on.
Yeah, what's the last part of the verse?
Who has not lifted up nafshi, my soul, to vanity, written nafsho, his soul. They have already established my soul, soul of David, side of faith, his soul, soul of a human being, so that when he departs this world, his soul will ascend by worthy deeds, sustaining him to walk among all those holy beings, as it is said, I will walk before God in the land of the living. Because he has not lifted up my soul to vanity, he will receive a blessing from God.
Okay, so they tied together this last bit about one who is not lifted up nafshi, my soul, to vanity, but there's a kativ kari situation where it's written nafsho, but we say it nafshi, and they explain that there's a tradition of interpreting the Book of Psalms that when David, who is the author of the Book of Psalms, traditionally writes nafshi, my soul, it means David's literal soul. But when it says nafsho, one soul, it means in the abstract, talking about anyone, right? The soul of any human being. So here we have kind of both happening at the same time, and it's encouraging us to read it the way it's written, the kativ, rather than the kari, as one who does not lift up their soul to vanity. And vanity, probably not the best word as usual, but we get the sense, right? Someone who doesn't take for granted the sanctity of their life. And we come back to Psalms 116, I will walk before God in the land of the living, because he has not lifted up my soul to vanity, he will receive a blessing from God. So the answer is ultimately given to the question, although it's slightly unsatisfying. How would you phrase the answer that has been given to this question? Who is it that can ascend to the mountain of God? Who's eligible and why?
Those who aren't weighed down by the things they've done.
Hmm.
A pure person. It's almost
Yeah.
unobtainium.
Almost, sorry, what did you say, Jason?
Unobtainable.
Yeah. It feels like a quite big ask, right? To be pure of heart, pure of hand, pure of mind, to be constantly cleaving to God, to never falter, to always kind of orient yourself in this direction.
Where does that tie in with, in the funeral service, you say, even if someone you think was so incredible, even they had some sin in their life.
Yeah, we do. We remind ourselves many times, right? There is no one who lives and does not sin, we say, right? Even us, even our ancestors, everyone makes mistakes. We stress that. And so I think that does bring us back to looking at this passage, looking at this whole ideal, right? We can summarize the idea as that four-word phrase, if holiness, holiness, if defilement, defilement. The idea is not about all or nothing, I don't think, although it doesn't spell it out for us. It's much more about the tendency, it's a trajectory. If generally your life tends towards holiness, you try and do good things, you act well, and you look to do good, you desire good, then you'll be drawn towards good naturally. You've kind of coded yourself as being in the realm of holiness. I don't think a few mistakes change that, and I don't think it's saying that. And similarly, if overall, on balance, you kind of tend towards defilement, you tend to make bad choices behaviorally, culturally, whatever culturally, your desire is bad, whatever it is, right? You do things that are not ideal. That's going to then change the way in which your soul is actually oriented. It will have an effect on you. And I think I know it's probably a foreign source for this, but if we go to Maimonides and to elsewhere who talk about morality, they do stress, Jewish sources usually stress that being good is about being mostly good. It's not about being perfect. We're not asked to be perfect. We're asked to be more good than bad, to be 51% or more good, if we want to quantify it. And I think that's what it's portraying here is kind of there's two routes to go down, one that goes towards holiness and one that goes towards defilement. And while that seems very black and white, it's about kind of which one do we tend towards as a tendency rather than necessarily a toggle switch that guides us from one to the other.
Oh, sorry, Jason had his hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I was going to ask, so I think I remember there's this idea of the soul being made up of many pieces. If your soul gets smashed into pieces when you die, do all the good deeds bits of soul go this way and the not so good go this way, or something?
Good question. It's not necessarily ever explained in such clear terms that we can say, but you know, they talk about the soul as quite a unitary thing, right? Your soul itself is pulled this way or that way, and they very commonly use this very endearing feminine language, right? She, the soul, is going to go this way or that way, either be an angel or a demon. It seems very much like it's a one whole thing. But you're right, there is a rich tradition of seeing the soul as a composite. So how does this whole dynamic play into that, right? Where do all the pieces get redistributed based on the overall proportion of goodness versus badness? You know, is it kind of a calculation? Like, okay, well, 70% of them are going to go into a good soul and the other ones are going to go back. It feels like, you know, like the scales. And I can't help but remember the fact that our whole tradition, although it's a long way from the Zohar, emerges from ancient Egypt. And the imagery of ancient Egypt about the Book of the Dead and elsewhere is always this idea of scales, right? That when you die, your heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which represents order and justice and goodness. And if your heart is heavier than the feather, then you get consumed immediately by the horrible monster who lives under the scales called Amit. But if your heart is lighter than the feather, then you get to live on in the afterlife forever in bliss. And, you know, there's a similar kind of literally, you just have to tip the scales a little bit to good, and then you're safe. But if they tip a little bit to bad, then everything gets destroyed. And it feels high stakes, but also there's something refreshing about the idea that if you find you're not happy with the proportion of your good and bad actions, probably there's enough time to address that. Because if you start doing more good things than bad, you can probably change the balance overall. But none of us have a perfect accounting, despite our days going and reporting on us every evening when they change over. Lee, any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I'm just gonna tip that on its head a little bit. So I think in the reading, the notion of it, of the dichotomy between holiness and was calling it defilement, that's the viewpoint he was describing the children of the East as teaching. Whereas later on, it leans more into the idea of vanity, and when I think of vanity, I think of Kohelet, and I think of, well, how at least I've read Kohelet, thinking of vanity as being this sort of transient things that are sort of devoid of meaning, or that aren't what I'd call like eternal things, that don't transcend time, things that are transient, things that aren't permanent and fixed like God. And that the someone who is in the direction to go towards to stand on the mountain of God is one who their life's focus is on those non-transient things, the more eternal, more significant things. So not necessarily about good and evil, but rather about the value, like the majesty of life, on divine things that aren't necessarily good or evil, but that transcend what's the word, linear time.
It's beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful way to interpret this, right? That actually the choice to be faced is between transcendent and transient, and we become like the thing we choose, right? Which is the overall statement here. So if we choose transcendence, in our day-to-day lives, then we transcend, right? We live on and we take on the attributes of that. But if we choose transience, the things which it translates as vanity, and I think you're right, that's the Kohelet version of vanity, which is different. It's about things that are temporary. If we choose to live only for things that are temporary and don't last, then we become like them, right? We start to imitate and actually be like the things we choose to follow, the things we cleave to. And there's a certain kind of justice in that that's hard to argue with, and also a pretty stark reminder, I suppose, about the importance of every day, which is where it starts us. I really like that interpretation of it. Transcendence versus transience. Well, good news is the day has only just begun in the Hebrew calendar, at least. So you've got plenty of time still to make sure it offers a good report on you at the end of tomorrow afternoon. And I hope it's a good day and a good week. And thank you for joining me tonight. I believe we're back next week to do some more learning because the schedule got a bit jumbled. But check in the WhatsApp group if you're not sure. Thank you for being with us.